Usually when we talk about like a medical diagnosis, there's this comforting expectation of mechanical precision.
Right, yeah, like it's a binary thing.
Exactly. You break your arm, you go to the hospital, the x-ray shows this jagged white line on a black background, and the doctor he points to the fracture.
The problem is totally visible.
Yes. It's visible, it's categorized, and the solution is straightforward. You put a cast on it.
And I think, we crave that level of diagnostic clarity in almost every aspect of life. We want to see the fracture so we can apply the cast.
But step into the world of geopolitics.
Oh, man.
Right. Or military strategy or regional conflict, and suddenly that x-ray machine just shatters. We're no longer looking at clean binary lines. We're staring at a strategic landscape that is basically the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Yeah, the variables are constantly shifting. What looks like a clear picture on the surface is almost always hiding this massive, tangled network of unseen complications underneath.
Which is exactly why we're here.
Okay.
So welcome to today's deep dive. Today's mission is to make sense of a massive, rapidly expanding web of conflict in the Middle East. And to do this, we are unpacking a really fascinating intelligence discussion from a recent source, an extensive interview that breaks down the tactical, the economic, and the psychological realities on the ground right now.
And just to understand the scope of what we're dealing with, you have to look past the isolated headlines, the skirmishes in the desert.
Right.
We're evaluating a chain reaction here. Misjudging an opponent's culture, their adaptability, and their pain tolerance can basically render even the most advanced, heavily funded military operations surprisingly ineffective.
Okay, but before we go any further, I really need to set a critical ground rule for our discussion today, especially for you listening at home.
Yeah, this is important.
The source material we're unpacking contains highly politically charged commentary. It specifically critiques the military strategy of the Trump administration, United States foreign policy, and the actions of various regional powers in the Middle East. So, listen closely. We are strictly impartial guides today.
Absolutely.
You're not taking sides, we're not endorsing any political figures, and we're not validating the viewpoints in our source. We are simply unpacking the claims and ideas presented in the material so you can understand the arguments being made.
Our job is just to lift the hood, show you the engine, and explain how the pieces are supposedly fitting together, nothing more.
Exactly, thank you. Because the stakes outlined in this material are, they're undeniably global. We're looking at the mechanics of a potential global oil shock, a massive displacement of American military power projection, and fundamentally this clash between multi-billion-dollar technology and sheer human resilience.
Right, the human element is huge here.
It is. So I want to jump straight into the economic jugular. Let's look at the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb waterway, and the global oil supply. Because, let's be real, this affects the cost of everything around you.
Everything.
Our source details how Saudi Arabia recently bombed the Hodeidah port in Yemen. And in return, the Houthis in Yemen systematically targeted shipping in the Bab el-Mandeb. And they aren't just taking pot shots at small cargo boats, right?
No, they are targeting Saudi VLCCs.
VLCCs.
Yeah, very large crude carriers. And to visualize this, do not picture a standard ship. A VLCC is basically a floating skyscraper laid on its side.
Skyscraper.
Literally. They can be over 1,000 feet long, and they carry roughly 2 million barrels of crude oil.
2 million barrels on one ship.
One ship. And the source notes that one massive Saudi VLCC was recently set aflame, just completely on fire. Another ship, the NCC Mara, suffered a direct drone attack. So the risk threshold in the Red Sea has spiked so dramatically that it now mirrors the danger of the Strait of Hormuz. Because of this kinetic threat, 8 to 10 of these massive VLCCs literally just turned around.
They just turned back.
Yeah.
Except, and this is where it gets crazy, there is a very specific exception detailed in the source.
Yeah.
2 ships did sail through the chaos, completely untouched.
Yeah.
Because they were heading to China.
Right. The source describes this as an Iranian Revolutionary Guard multipass, which is, it highlights the selective interdiction strategy.
What did that mean, selective interdiction?
Basically, the Houthis and Iranian forces haven't entirely closed the waterway. They're just demonstrating the capability to selectively destroy cargo based on its destination.
Oh.
So if the destination is China, safe transit is granted, you get the multipass. For the Saudis and Western-aligned cargo, the passage is totally shut down.
Okay, I want to break down what shutting down that passage actually does to the physical movement of oil. Because normally this is a streamlined, highly optimized logistical loop, right?
Very optimized.
The Saudis, anticipating trouble in the Strait of Hormuz years ago, They shifted a lot of their export capacity to the East-West pipeline. And this pipeline pumps oil completely across the Saudi landmass to a port on the Red Sea called Yanbu.
Right. And when fully pressurized, that pipeline moves 5 to 7 million barrels a day.
Okay.
The standard operating procedure is pretty straightforward. A VLCC fills up at Yanbu, sails south through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and reaches major Asian markets, places like Shanghai or Singapore, in about 19 days.
19 days.
19 days. And that 19-day baseline is basically the mathematical assumption built into the entire global energy market.
But with the Bab el-Mandeb under threat, that 19-day baseline just disintegrates.
Totally gone.
The detour our source describes sounds like an absolute logistical nightmare because those Saudi VLCCs cannot safely sail south, so they are forced to sail north up the Red Sea, heading toward the Suez Canal.
And the problem with sailing north is just one of physical geography and physics.
How's
Well, a fully loaded VLCC is incredibly heavy. Its draft, which is the distance between the waterline and the bottom of the ship's hull, is too deep to physically fit through the shallow waters of the Suez Canal.
Wait, so they're too heavy for the canal?
Yeah, they would just scrape the bottom and run aground.
So they're trapped. I mean, they cannot go south because of missiles, and they cannot go north because the water is too shallow. So how on earth do they get the oil out?
They have to engage in a process called lightering.
Lightering.
Yeah. They park at the southern end of the Suez Canal, and they pump roughly 50% of their cargo into the SUMED pipeline. That's the Suez-Mediterranean pipeline, which runs overland through Egypt.
Wow.
And this is not a fast process. I mean, pumping 1 million barrels of highly viscous crude oil takes a significant amount of time.
I can't even imagine.
Right. But once the VLCC has regurgitated half its cargo, it rides higher in the water. Its draft is now shallow enough to carefully navigate the canal.
Okay, so the ship goes through the canal half empty. Meanwhile, that offloaded oil is traveling through a pipe across Egypt to a massive bunkering port west of Alexandria, right, on the Mediterranean Sea.
Exactly.
So the half-empty ship exits the canal, parks at Alexandria, and then they have to pump all that oil back into the hull.
Yep. They have to reload the vessel. But that's only half the battle. Once that VLCC is fully laden again, it is trapped in the Mediterranean.
Trapped again, because it can't go back through the Suez Canal.
Exactly, because it's too heavy again. So it must sail west, exit the Mediterranean through the Strait of Gibraltar, navigate down the entire west coast of Africa, round the treacherous waters of South Africa, cross the Indian Ocean, and finally limp into Asian ports.
Okay, for you listening, imagine your 20-minute highway commute to the office suddenly requires you to pull over, unpack half the contents of your trunk into a taxi, drive your car through a narrow pedestrian alleyway, meet the taxi on the other side, repack your trunk, and then drive across 3 state lines to get to your desk.
That is a brilliant way to picture it. The friction introduced into the system is just staggering.
Right. What was a 19-day transit from Yanbu to Asia suddenly inflates to a 48-day voyage.
And adding a month to a transit route for a massive vessel burns an astronomical amount of fuel. The source points out that the cost of diesel fuel for the vessel alone to make that massive detour is 4 to 5 times higher than the standard route.
4 to 5 times higher.
Yes. And the economic shockwave relies on a really crucial distinction here. This oil is not being sold on the speculative futures market. It is being sold on the physical oil market.
Meaning a refinery in Singapore physically needs that barrel of crude today to produce gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel for tomorrow.
Exactly. So if a barrel of oil is priced at, say, $85 when it leaves the port of Yanbu, the cascading costs of the detour, so the lightering fees in Egypt, the extra month of crew wages, the quadruple diesel burn, and the sheer scarcity caused by ships taking twice as long to complete a loop, all of that could cause the price of that physical barrel to skyrocket to $120 or even $150 by the time it reaches the Asian refinery.
Wow. So if this logistical bottleneck sustains, global refineries will start running their storage tanks dry.
Yeah.
It prompts a deeply unsettling question for you listening. Like, how fragile is our heavily optimized, just-in-time global economy when a single geographical choke point can be squeezed by a localized conflict?
It feels like the entire system is balanced on a knife edge, honestly.
It really does. Which begs the question of causality, right? What actually triggered this specific spike in chaos? Did they just wake up one day and decide to do this?
Not at all. The source traces the escalation back to a very specific deliberate provocation. About a week prior to this massive disruption in the shipping lanes, the Saudi military bombed the runway at the Sana'a airport in Yemen. They targeted the infrastructure to intercept a specific flight returning from the funeral of the Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei.
Right. The delegation was flying on an Iranian commercial airline, Mirage Airline, scheduled to land in Sana'a. By bombing the runway, the Saudis forced that aircraft to divert to the Hodeidah airport, which the source categorizes as like a nasty, underdeveloped little airstrip.
And the Saudis weren't just trying to inconvenience a diplomatic delegation.
Right.
The source states that the aircraft allegedly carried 10 to 12 Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps IRGC advisors. More importantly, it carried highly technical equipment designed to support and calibrate IRGC weapons systems that had previously been supplied to the Houthi forces.
Okay, so the Saudis identified high-value IRGC assets moving into Yemen and bombed the runway to disrupt their arrival.
Yep.
And the Houthis, in turn, viewed this as an unforgivable provocation and retaliated by shutting down the Bab el-Mandeb to Saudi shipping.
Exactly. And this sequence of events exposes a really profound misunderstanding in how Western intelligence often frames the Houthis.
How so?
Well, there is this prevalent narrative that treats the Houthis merely as Iranian proxies, as mercenaries acting purely on orders transmitted from Tehran, like a puppet master narrative.
But the source vehemently rejects that framing.
Totally rejects it.
Right. The Houthis are co-religionists. They share a fundamental religious and ideological bedrock with Iran, viewing Tehran as the cultural and spiritual center of their Shia diaspora. So they operate in unison with Iran out of shared conviction, not because they are hired guns awaiting a paycheck.
Right. And the source crystallizes this resilience with a really vivid phrase. They call them rifles and flip-flops.
Rifles and flip-flops.
Yeah, these are fighters who have endured years of warfare against the Saudis and the Emiratis militaries, backed by billions of dollars in advanced Western weaponry, satellite intelligence, precision munitions. And the Houthis fought them to a standstill using incredibly basic infantry gear.
But wait, if they were receiving technical equipment and advisors from the IRGC, they possess highly advanced systems, right? Why stick to the rifles in flip-flops insurgency model if you have, like, a garage full of ballistic missiles?
Strategic restraint.
Okay.
The source notes that while the Houthis do possess advanced Iranian ballistic missiles, they have exhibited remarkable discipline in their deployment. I mean, in 147 days of the broader regional conflict, the source points out they only fired 2 ballistic missiles toward Israel.
Only 2.
And those were clearly calibrated as warnings, not decapitation strikes. Firing a sophisticated anti-ship missile at a Saudi tanker or launching a targeted drone at the NCC Mara represents a significant calculated escalation to send a message. Their primary tactical advantage is their lack of glittering, centralized infrastructure.
You can't bomb what isn't there.
Right. You cannot easily execute a bombing campaign to force a surrender when the enemy's strength is their ability to survive and operate with almost nothing.
Okay, so if the Houthis in Iran are this philosophically aligned and this comfortable operating in austere conditions, how is the United States attempting to manage the escalation?
Well,
because the source dives deeply into the psychology of coercion, specifically critiquing the current U.S. leadership strategy.
yeah. The source argues that the strategy of the Trump administration, heavily influenced by figures like Pete Hegseth, is rooted in a profound cultural and psychological miscalculation.
The maximum pressure idea.
Exactly. The operating theory is that extreme kinetic pain delivered through overwhelming aerial bombardment will break the opponent's will and force Iran to the negotiating table with tears in their eyes.
Break their toys, destroy their infrastructure, and they will eventually capitulate just to make the pain stop.
That's the theory. The source also points out that pundits on cable news, specifically naming General Kellogg and General Keane, they actively advocate for escalating beyond bombing into a full ground invasion.
A ground invasion.
Yeah, they casually discuss seizing Karg Island, occupying Bandar Abbas, which is a major port city of 700,000 people, by the way, or taking over the islands in the Strait of Hormuz.
But the source characterizes these scenarios as rabid fantasies, right? Because they completely ignore the historical trauma and cultural ethos of the adversary.
Completely.
To understand why a bombing campaign will not force a quick surrender, the source draws a direct comparison to the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s.
Yeah, and that conflict was a meat grinder of World War I proportions. Trench warfare, chemical weapons, the whole 9 yards.
The demographic toll was unimaginable. The source notes that nearly 1 million people were lost between the two nations. Iran was literally sending children into minefields wearing headscarves, symbolizing Allah granting them entry to heaven.
And that's the point. A society that has endured that level of national sacrifice and maintained its sovereign cohesion, they do not possess the same breaking point as a Western democracy operating on a 4-year election cycle. The source contrasts the American political mindset, which often views geopolitical coercion like, scratching a rival's car with keys to annoy them into a
I
conversation.
still get annoyance.
Yeah, contrasting that with Iran's deeply ingrained multi-generational resilience. They are culturally prepared to absorb bombardment for years without fracturing.
And the disconnect between a television studio in Washington and the physical reality of the terrain is vast. The source brings up Matt Bracken, a former Navy SEAL, who actually understands the gritty, horrifying reality of transitioning from the surf zone to hostile ground.
Yeah, it's not a video game.
Exactly. Planning to roll into a mountainous country of 93 million highly motivated people is not just some map exercise. It places the U.S. at a massive strategic disadvantage, basically searching for a cultural breaking point that simply may not exist.
And the assumption of a quick victory relies on the adversary behaving according to your own cultural logic. But the region is incredibly complex, and the narrative of who is actually fighting whom is heavily manipulated.
What do you mean?
We'll take the Wall Street Journal. They recently published a report suggesting the region was actively turning on Iran. They claimed that Bahrain and Kuwait, operating with Emirati intelligence and defense cover, carried out airstrikes on Ionian territory, possibly targeting Larak Island.
Okay, so a united Gulf Arab front taking the kinetic fight directly to Tehran. That sounds like a massive geopolitical shift.
It does.
Yet our source is highly skeptical, essentially calling the logistics of this supposed strike into question.
The skepticism is rooted in the raw mechanics of executing a deep strike mission. Take Kuwait, for example. The source points out that Kuwait's air force relies on older or shorter-range fighter jets. Larak Island is located in the south, near the Strait of Hormuz.
Right.
A Kuwaiti jet cannot simply take off, fly straight across the heavily monitored Persian Gulf, drop a payload, and fly back. They would run out of fuel or be immediately painted by Iranian air defense radars.
So to even attempt it, they would have to secretly transit south to a closer staging base, right? Perhaps Al Dhafra in the United Arab Emirates, and launch the strike from there.
Even launching from the UAE, the fuel math is incredibly tight. The source reflects on observing previous Iraqi bombing campaigns against Larak Island and notes that the distance required 3 separate in-flight mid-air refuelings just to complete the round trip.
3 mid-air refueling.
This air refueling is not a simple maneuver. It requires massive, slow-moving tanker aircraft orbiting in contested airspace.
And it requires AWSCS coordination,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
For those unfamiliar, AWSCS Airborne Warning and Control System are those massive planes with the rotating radar domes on top. They manage the entire battle space. They track friendly and enemy aircraft. They manage IFF, identify friend or foe signals, so air defenses don't shoot down their own pilots.
And executing a multi-jet strike package with 3 mid-air refuelings requires a level of intelligence support, tanker coordination, and airspace deconfliction that Bahrain and Kuwait simply cannot manage independently.
They need help.
Exactly. The source argues that pulling this off without the United States heavily coordinating the entire operation is highly improbable. Furthermore, the risk calculus for a nation like Bahrain is basically suicidal.
Why?
Bahrain is a tiny island nation hosting the U.S. Fifth Fleet. If a Bahraini pilot executed a strike, Iran could retaliate and level the entire country with ballistic missiles in a matter of minutes.
Okay, the source also points out a glaring absence in this supposed coalition. The United Arab Emirates possesses a highly capable modern air force. They have flown deep strike missions in the past. The source mentions seeing Emirati Mirage 2000s operating over Isfahan and Shiraz during previous conflicts.
Yep.
Yet the UAE supposedly provided only intelligence cover this time, not kinetic aircraft. Why is that?
The UAE's physical absence is a vital clue here. The Emiratis have absorbed heavy fire in the past, facing hundreds of ballistic missiles and thousands of drones. They intimately understand the cost of a direct confrontation with Iran.
So they're staying out of it.
Right. The source suspects a back-channel diplomatic understanding is at play. The UAE has not been recently attacked by Iran, suggesting they have quietly negotiated to stay out of the direct line of fire.
So if the logistical fuel math is nearly impossible, the AWACS coordination requires U.S. assets, and the risk of annihilation for Bahrain is too high, What was this Wall Street Journal report? Like, was it just made up?
The source categorizes the report as a likely information
An
operation.
information operation.
Yeah. It is a piece of strategic communication, potentially seeded by someone within the U.S. administration, designed to project the illusion of a unified, aggressive Gulf Arab coalition standing against Iran, essentially masking the reality of regional hesitation.
Wow. And while discussing the fog of war and the danger of manipulated narratives, the source drops a chilling detail about a chaotic miscalculation that occurred around the time of the interview. The U.S. Navy mistakenly fired 2 missiles at an Omani LPG tanker in the Gulf of Oman. Yeah, that was a disaster. The Navy reportedly believed the vessel was a sanctioned ship transporting Iranian gas. And an LPG tanker carries liquefied petroleum gas substances like propane or butane stored under immense pressure.
Right, so it's not crude oil, it's highly explosive gas.
Exactly. And the strike tragically killed 2 crew members, severely damaged the engine room, and left the massive vessel immobilized in open water.
It is a devastating, lethal error. When the airspace is saturated with drones, the waterways are contested, and radar operators are staring at screens for hours on edge, the margin for error just evaporates. A friendly fire incident on an explosive gas tanker or a fabricated intelligence report could easily trigger an uncontrollable regional war.
The environment is incredibly volatile.
Extremely. So if the Gulf Arab coalition strike was largely a phantom narrative, what is the United States military actually experiencing in the theater, like on the ground, day to day?
Well, the source paints a picture of a profound tactical retreat driven by a systematic campaign to blind American early warning systems.
Blind them. Yeah, the technological asymmetry is jarring. The source details how a state-of-the-art $2 billion Qatari radar system, a centerpiece of airspace management over the Persian Gulf, was completely destroyed by 2 drones that cost roughly $20,000 each.
Let me just repeat that for you listening.
Yeah.
A $2 billion sensory apparatus eliminated by $40,000 of remote-controlled fiberglass and explosives.
That's the math. It's crazy.
It's mind-blowing.
And the campaign to blind the architecture extended way beyond Qatar. The source notes that vehicle-mounted TOAD radars, the terminal high-altitude area defense systems designed to intercept ballistic missiles, were successfully targeted in the UAE and inside Jordan.
And the destruction of the Jordanian radar is particularly critical, right?
Oh, absolutely. That specific system previously provided Israel with a vital 10 to 12 minutes of early warning for incoming Iranian ballistic missiles. Erasing that radar drastically compresses the reaction time for air defense networks.
But they didn't stop at peripheral radars in the desert. The source states that the headquarters of the U.S. Fifth Fleet in Bahrain took a direct drone hit to its primary communications dish. And this event was reportedly broadcast live.
And the destruction of the comms dish effectively severed the command center's ability to operate securely in the theater. As a result, personnel from the Fifth Fleet Command were evacuated out of the Middle East entirely, relocating to Norfolk, Virginia, where they are now forced to manage naval operations via remote telemetry.
Okay, wait. We spent decades building these impenetrable fortress bases, and a handful of cheap drones forces the Navy to run the Middle East from the coast of Virginia.
From Virginia, yeah.
But how are these munitions bypassing the multi-million-dollar Patriot missile batteries? Because the Patriot system is globally recognized as the gold standard for shooting down incoming threats.
Yeah.
How are they getting past?
Okay, so the Patriot system relies on calculating a predictable geometric path. When a traditional ballistic missile is launched, it follows a parabolic arc, much like a baseball hit deep into the outfield, right?
Right, like an arc.
Exactly. As soon as the missile clears the atmosphere, radar systems track its trajectory. The computers calculate the speed, the angle, the descent curve, predicting exactly where that warhead will be in space at any given microsecond.
Okay.
The Patriot then fires a kinetic interceptor to cross paths with that predicted location. It does not chase the missile, it meets the missile at a mathematically predetermined coordinate.
It meets it where it's going to be.
Exactly. But the source explains that Iran has introduced a technological wildcard that completely breaks this math.
The Khyber-Shikin missile.
Yes, the Khyber-Shikin is a solid-fueled ballistic missile. Solid fuel is critical because it means the missile does not require hours of volatile liquid fueling on a launch pad where satellites can see it.
Right, it's basically ready to launch in minutes.
Exactly. But its true lethality lies in its terminal phase. The warhead of the Khyber-Shikin separates and maneuvers independently in space before it begins its final descent.
It changes its trajectory mid-flight.
Yes. Precisely when the Patriot system's computer has calculated the intercept coordinate based on the initial parabolic arc, the Khyber-Sheikhan warhead shifts its path.
Wow.
The geometry changes instantly. The math the Patriot relies on is invalidated, the interceptor flies to an empty point in space, and the Khyber-Sheikhan impacts the target.
Because the early warning radars are blinded, the comms dishes are destroyed, and the incoming missiles can maneuver past the Patriot batteries, U.S. forces are physically scattering to survive.
Yeah, the displacement of assets is massive. The source details how the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar was largely emptied. Central command operations are reportedly shifting out of Qatar to operate from Israel, which pushes American command and control an hour to an hour and a half further away from Iran's borders.
And maritime patrol aircraft are being pulled out of the Persian Gulf entirely, relocating to Aqqa in Jordan.
Right, and the most extreme example the source mentions is that some aircraft are being forced to operate out of Naval Air Station Sigonella, located in Sicily, Italy.
Okay, let's just think about this for a second. Operating a Persian Gulf mission from Sicily. That is a logistical nightmare.
It really is.
I mean, it requires a 5-hour flight straight across the Mediterranean Sea, plus another hour and a half just to transit the airspace required to reach the Persian Gulf before the aircraft even begins its actual combat patrol.
Right. You are burning massive amounts of jet fuel, requiring extensive mid-air tanker support, and frankly, exhausting the stamina of the flight crews just commuting to the battle space.
Which directly challenges the pundits demanding a massive, sustained bombing campaign. I mean, if your command centers are in Virginia, your maritime planes are in Sicily, and your radars are blind, how do you execute the 400 to 500 airstrikes a day that cable news commentators are demanding?
You don't. The source, leaning on extensive intelligence and logistical background, completely debunks the feasibility of a 500 strike per day operational tempo. They compare the current posture to Operation Desert Storm in 1991. During Desert Storm, the U.S. coalition achieved roughly 600 strikes per day. However, they accomplished that because they had uncontested access to every single major airbase in Saudi Arabia and the surrounding region, supplemented by 6 aircraft carriers, each holding 90 to 100 aircraft.
It was an armada operating with impunity in safe airspace. Today, the bases are farther away, the airspace is contested, and the carrier presence is reduced. You cannot launch a jet from Sicily, fly 6.5 hours, drop a payload, fly 6.5 hours back, land, refuel, rearm, rest the pilot, and maintain a 500-strike daily cadence. It's impossible.
It is physically impossible. And the barrier is not just distance and fatigue, it is the physical inventory of the munitions themselves.
Right.
The source drops a massive strategic warning here. The United States is rapidly depleting its stockpile of precision strike munitions.
The U.S. has burned through perhaps half of its entire global inventory of advanced precision weapons on this specific conflict. We're talking about Tomahawk cruise missiles and naval strike missiles, weapons that cost millions of dollars each and take years to manufacture.
Years.
Right. And these weapons were specifically designed and stockpiled to penetrate the dense, highly sophisticated air defense networks of near-peer adversaries like China or Russia.
Exactly. And instead of reserving them for a major global conflict, the source argues these high-end munitions are being wasted on targets that could have been neutralized with basic dumb bombs dropped from a high-altitude B-1 bomber.
Right, they're using a scalpel as a sledgehammer.
Right. The source claims that many of these expensive strikes were authorized simply because they demonstrated capability for domestic political consumption, not because the specific target actually required a multi-million-dollar cruise missile.
Which is wild. And the source provides a staggering example of munitions consumption using a B-1 bomber against an Iranian regular army base, the Avaz Artesh base.
Yeah.
A single B-1 bomber on a single sortie dropped 35 2B JDAMs on the facility.
Right, and a JDAM joint direct attack munition is essentially a traditional unguided gravity bomb fitted with a bolt-on GPS guidance kit and tail fins to make it a precision weapon. Using 35 precision-guided bombs to obliterate one base is a massive drain on the logistics chain.
35 on one base.
If you attempt to scale that consumption rate up to 500 strikes a day across a country as massive as Iran, which the source notes is a 3.5-hour flight from border to border, you will empty the military's magazines in a matter of weeks.
You quickly reach a phenomenon known as target saturation. You blow up all the high-value infrastructure in the first few days, and then you're just dropping multi-million-dollar GPS-guided bombs on empty sand, abandoned barracks, and previously created rubble purely to maintain the illusion of an operational tempo.
And beyond the mathematical waste of dropping expensive bombs on rubble, the source highlights a severe psychological backfire regarding the targeting of the Artesh, the regular army.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Early in the escalating tensions, the U.S. was allegedly avoiding kinetic strikes against the Iranian regular army.
Right. The strategic hope, particularly pushed during the Trump administration, was that by sparing the regular army, the Artesh might eventually rise up, fracture the military apparatus, and overthrow the government and the hardline IRGC, like a classic divide-and-conquer strategy.
But the strategy shifted, and the U.S. began actively bombing Artesh facilities like the Avaz base. And the result was the exact opposite of a fracture.
Of course it was.
By bombing the regular army, the U.S. triggered a deep sense of national loyalty. Soldiers who swore an oath to defend their homeland united against the external aggressor.
So now the Artesh is fighting seamlessly alongside the IRGC.
Exactly. The source observes that the U.S. is now bombing empty barracks 100 days too late, wasting precious munitions, and successfully unifying the enemy forces in the process.
If the United States drains its inventory of high-end precision munitions in the Middle East trying to bomb empty barracks, the global posture of the military is severely compromised. I mean, if a conflict erupts in the Pacific, the magazines are half empty. It is a terrifying strategic misallocation of resources.
It really is. Which brings us to the final tactical threat discussed in the source material. When military infrastructure is hardened or mobile and precision munitions are running low, politicians often threaten critical civilian infrastructure.
Right. The president reportedly issued a threat that if the attacks on global shipping did not cease, the U.S. would systematically target civilian logistics, specifically threatening to bomb one Iranian bridge for every commercial ship attacked. It is designed to sound like a crippling, heavy-handed ultimatum.
But the source dismisses this threat as largely meaningless in the context of the region's geography and culture. Iran is a massive country with thousands of bridges. Systematically bombing them does not paralyze a nation of 93 million people used to hardship.
And the source draws a fascinating parallel to the conflict in eastern Ukraine to illustrate how ineffective bridge bombing can be against a mobilized population.
Right. In eastern Ukraine, Russian forces heavily targeted and destroyed virtually every major bridge in certain sectors to sever logistical supply lines. And the local population and the military did not surrender because the asphalt was gone.
Right, what did they do?
They immediately mobilized bulldozers and excavators, carved dirt paths down the river embankments, drove their vehicles across the shallow ravines or pontoons, and drove up the other side.
The source notes that when a bridge near the Iranian port of Bandar Abbas was hit during previous skirmishes, civilian traffic was flowing around the cratered structure the very next day. A dirt bypass slows down a tractor trailer? Sure, but it absolutely does not sever the logistical spine of the country.
Not at all. Furthermore, the military traffic, specifically the IRGC, does not travel in massive, easily identifiable, camouflaged convoys rolling down the main highways waiting to be targeted by drones.
How do they travel?
The source explains that they utilize POVs, privately owned vehicles. They move personnel and light equipment in standard civilian cars and pickup trucks, 4 to 6 individuals at a time.
So from the optical sensor of a drone at 20,000 feet, an IRGC movement looks exactly like regular civilian traffic commuting on a Friday night.
Exactly.
You cannot mathematically or ethically bomb every pickup truck in a country of 93 million people.
You just can't. And this fundamental clash between Western technological assumptions and Eastern operational resilience is perfectly encapsulated in the source's final anecdote.
Oh, this part is crazy.
Yeah. The Wall Street Journal recently published an article expressing bewilderment that Iran was able to so rapidly repair and rebuild damaged infrastructure, ports, bridges, and specifically hardened missile bases nestled deep inside mountain ranges.
Right, because the Western perspective assumes that if you drop massive ordnance on a mountain tunnel complex like the one the U.S. recently bombed in Sirik in southern Iran, and you collapse the entrance, the target is permanently neutralized.
Because that is how the West solves a collapsed tunnel. As the source critically observes, if the U.S. military needed to clear a collapsed mountain bunker, they would issue a $250 million contract to a major defense logistics corporation like KBR.
Right.
It would require weeks of logistical planning, the implementation of rigid safety protocols, and the slow transport of heavy mining machinery into a combat zone.
But Iran does not rely on billion-dollar corporate contracts.
No.
They rely on the Basish, a massive, highly mobilized volunteer paramilitary force. They rely on the sheer volume of human labor. They literally just hand a shovel to every available man.
And the source points out a detail that just shatters the Western assumption of neutralization. These are massive, concrete reinforced tunnels bored deep into solid rock. It is incredibly naive to assume the Iranians didn't preemptively park excavators, bulldozers, and dump trucks deep inside the tunnels before the bombing even began.
We're launching multi-million-dollar, highly sophisticated munitions to hit the front door of a mountain, completely ignoring the fact that the people inside have heavy machinery, 1,000,000 shovels, and they do not care how many days it takes to dig their way out.
The source paints a cinematic, almost mocking picture of the reality on the ground.
Yeah.
Deep inside that mountain tunnel in Sirak, the Iranian operators are sitting in the dark, eating dates and drinking tea, listening to the concussive thuds of American bombs shaking the rock outside. They are literally keeping a tally mark on the tunnel wall, counting how many multi-million-dollar weapons the West is wasting against the mountain.
They're just waiting for the bombardment to stop.
Yeah.
And the moment the skies are clear, they fire up the backhoes parked inside, dig through the rubble from the inside out, unseal the blast doors, and roll out their mobile anti-ship missile launchers.
Exactly. The source explicitly warns that underestimating your opponent's resourcefulness is a fatal flaw. They discard rigid Western safety protocols and bureaucratic contracting, and they simply get the job done through endurance.
And this really brings the entire narrative full circle. We began this deep dive examining a logistical choke point in the Red Sea, where the baseline math of global shipping was violently disrupted.
Oh, dear.
We traced that disruption to a specific runway bombing, revealing a resilient adversary that relies on rifles and flip-flops rather than centralized infrastructure. We watched the failure of extreme psychological coercion, the blinding of billion-dollar early warning radars by cheap, expendable drones, a mathematical impossibility of sustaining a 500-strike-a-day bombing campaign, and finally, the triumph of the shovel and the excavator over the precision-guided smart bomb.
The source material really forces us to reevaluate the metrics of power. I mean, we have spent the last century defining military and global supremacy strictly through the lens of capital, complex logistics, and the sophistication of our microchips.
The ultimate question for you to walk away with is this. As warfare becomes increasingly asymmetric, and as complex, highly optimized systems become more fragile to keep disruptions, will the superpowers of the 21st century be defined by the elegance of their technology, or by the sheer unbreakable endurance of their populations?
It's a lot to think about.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines, look for the heavy machinery hidden beneath the mountain, and remember that the most critical details are always buried beneath the muddy waters. See you next time.